Hey guys, it's Ellie. Welcome back to Bite-Sized Book of Mormon. I'm glad to have you with me. So, if you've never been here before, this is just a podcast where we read through one chapter of the Book of Mormon each episode, and to give a little bit of context, a little bit of insight, a little bit of good times. So, stick around. So, if you remember last episode, we read Alma chapter 61, which is the Chief Judge Pahoran's response to Captain Moroni's crazy, angry letter. And so, the last two chapters before this have been a back and forth from first Moroni and then Pahoran's response. And at the end of Pahoran's response, Pahoran was like, hey, Moroni, the capital city has been taken over by dissenters. Can you bring armies, please? I want to take it back. And so presumably, that is what this chapter is. Captain Moroni is going to bring armies to Zarahemla, his own capital city, and they're going to attack it and take it back from the dissenters, from the kingmen. So anyways, yeah, I think without further ado, let's see how that all goes down in Alma chapter 62. And now it came to pass that when Moroni had received this epistle, his heart did take courage, and was filled with exceedingly great joy because of the faithfulness of Pahoran, that he was not also a traitor to the freedom and cause of his country. But he did also mourn exceedingly because of the iniquity of those who had driven Pahoran from the judgment seat, yea, in fine because of those who had rebelled against their country and also their God. And it came to pass that Moroni took a small number of men, according to the desire of Pahoran, and gave Lehi and Teancum command over the remainder of his army, and took his march towards the land of Gideon. And he did raise the standard of liberty in whatsoever place he did enter, and gained whatsoever force he could in all his march towards the land of Gideon. And it came to pass that thousands did flock unto his standard, and did take up their swords in the defense of their freedom, that they might not come into bondage. And thus, when Moroni had gathered together whatsoever men he could in all his march, he came to the land of Gideon, and uniting his forces with those of Pahoran, they became exceedingly strong, even stronger than the men of Pachus, who was the king of those dissenters who had driven the freemen out of the land of Zarahemla, and had taken possession of the land. And it came to pass that Moroni and Pahoran went down with their armies into the land of Zarahemla, and went forth against the city, and did meet the men of Pachus, insomuch that they did come to battle. So Moroni, as he went to the land of Gideon, which is where Pahoran was, because he's not in Zarahemla because they kicked him out, he gathered men on his way, and whatever city he passed by, he raised his standard of liberty, and people who loved freedom joined him. So if you remember what the title of Liberty itself says, he wrote, "In memory of our God, our religion and freedom, and our peace, our wives and our children." That is what he wrote on the Standard of Liberty, and that is what people flocked to when it came to gathering an army to fight against the tyranny of the kingmen and the dissenters led by Pachus in the city of Zarahemla. And so once Moroni gets to Gideon, he links up with Pahoran and his men, however many he has, which is probably not too many, and they leave to fight the people in Zarahemla. They face the defenses of the city and the armies of Pachus, and at the end of verse 7, it says, "And they went to battle." And so it must feel strange for Captain Moroni and Pahoran to bring their own armies to their own doorstep. Again, Pahoran is the chief judge. He lives in the capital. This is his home. And Captain Moroni is also a really high-powered general, and so he also is probably based out of Zarahemla. He probably lives there. Again, it's probably his home. So what must it feel like to have to bring armies against it when that's just where you live, you know? It's gotta feel strange, and yet they're doing it for the sake of freedom, for the sake of God, and for the sake of their families. And behold, Pachus was slain, and his men were taken prisoners, and Pahoran was restored to his judgment seat. And the men of Pachus received their trial according to the law, and also those kingmen who had been taken and cast into prison, and they were executed according to the law. Yea, those men of Pachus and those kingmen, whosoever would not take up arms in the defense of their country, but would fight against it, were put to death. And thus it became expedient that the law should be strictly observed for the safety of their country, yea, and whosoever was found denying their freedom was speedily executed according to the law. And thus ended the 30th year of the reign of the judges over the people of Nephi, Moroni and Pahoran having restored peace to the land of Zarahemla among their own people, having inflicted death upon all those who were not true to the cause of freedom. So, that battle lasted exactly one verse. In fact, not even a verse, because the verse before, in verse 7, it says they started battle, and then verse 8 literally just says, and Pacus was killed and his people were taken prisoner. So, ooh, what a dramatic battle. Not even one verse long. But anyways, now we're kind of seeing the result of this battle, right? Everyone who's getting punished, what their punishments are, and for what crimes. And what we're seeing is that they're very strictly, basically executing everybody who is not lined up with them on the cause of freedom and justice. Like, if they are not on the same page when it comes to freedom and, the system of judges, etc., they are killed. And everyone who was a kingman was given the opportunity to flip and fight for peace and fight for justice and democracy, and those who didn't were killed. And I said this before when we had the earlier incident with the kingman, but what this tells me is that internal conflict is extremely destructive, and we should be doing anything in our power to excise whatever is causing that internal conflict, to figure out whatever is causing that internal conflict, so that we can have in ourselves a united front, so that we can be more sure about our choices. Because if there's difficulty inside of you, if you aren't sure how things should go, or if you're fighting with yourself, you aren't going to be confident in your choices. And there's going to be dissonance, right? Cognitive dissonance. And that is extremely weakening. And that is what the story is telling me, is that these people went to such great lengths to restore peace and internal consistency. And they would do anything. They would kill hundreds or thousands of people to maintain that internal peace. Because having that as a foundation is so strong and so powerful. And so, we can take this and apply this to ourselves. What do we need to do to achieve this level of internal unity? Is there something in us that is fighting with another part of ourselves? Are we not sure about something? And obviously, doubts are not bad, but we shouldn't just live with them forever. We should figure them out. We should ask those hard questions, get those hard answers, and we should work on it. Doubts are healthy. They help us grow and evolve as believers, but letting them just sit there, simmer in us, is not a way to have healthy spirituality, right? So what do we need to do to get out that internal conflict within ourselves? Do we need to do some serious praying? Do we need to really study? Or do we need to make a big decision that we're afraid of? Whatever it is, this chapter is telling me that it is extremely important that we do that thing. So anyways, they're killing a lot of people for this cause, right? For the cause of freedom, to maintain consistency and unity. Anyways, very intense. Let's see where this goes from here. And it came to pass in the commencement of the 31st year of the reign of the judges over the people of Nephi, Moroni immediately caused that provisions should be sent, and also an army of 6,000 men should be sent unto Helaman to assist him in preserving that part of the land. And he also caused that an army of 6,000 men with a sufficient quantity of food should be sent to the armies of Lehi and Teancum. And it came to pass that this was done to fortify the land against the Lamanites. And it came to pass that Moroni and Pahoran, leaving a large body of men in the land of Zarahemla, took their march with a large body of men towards the land of Nephihah, being determined to overthrow the Lamanites in that city. And it came to pass that as they were marching towards the land, they took a large body of men of the Lamanites, and slew many of them, and took their provisions and their weapons of war. And it came to pass that after they had taken them, they caused them to enter into a covenant, that they would no more take up their weapons of war against the Nephites. And when they had entered into this covenant, they sent them to dwell with the people of Ammon, and they were in number about 4,000 who had not been slain. So this is kind of a little side interaction that the Nephites have with the Lamanites. It just says that they took a large body of men of the Lamanites and slew many, and took their provisions and their weapons. And so it sounds like they kind of came across an army while they were marching towards the land of Nephihah, which, if you remember in Alma 59, I believe, it was mentioned that Nephihah was in kind of Captain Moroni's region of jurisdiction, and it was taken over by Lamanites. And that is partially what motivated Moroni to send that extremely strongly worded letter to Zarahemla, because he was like, hey, we are losing people here. We are having people die here because we don't have enough, right? So this city that they're trying to take back now is what started kind of this whole thing. What started Pahoran to ask Moroni to bring armies to Zarahemla, and eventually what led them to take Zarahemla back. And so, yeah, this is kind of coming a little bit full circle. But on their way to Nephihah, they ran into Lamanites, and it says that in verses 16 and 17, they had the living ones make a covenant to be like, hey, you won't fight anymore, and we won't kill you anymore. Like, yippee, we're done. And what I love about this section and why it stuck out to me is because in verse 17 it says, and when they had entered into this covenant, they sent them to dwell with the people of Ammon. And so when the Nephites say they wish they didn't have to kill the Lamanites, those aren't just empty words. They really mean that. Because these Lamanites had just tried to kill them. Like, they were just in battle. They just killed each other. And instead of taking revenge on them or even taking them prisoner, they just say, hey, make a covenant of peace, and you can live in our lands under our protection. Because if you remember the people of Ammon, those are the Anti-Nephi Lehis. They made the covenant to never fight again, and they are under the protection of the Nephite armies. And so, literally, the Nephites are offering them not only a place to live, but protection by the armies that they were just fighting. That is a whole nother level of mercy and grace. And obviously, this is war, there was death, and it was bad all in all, but the Nephites are giving out as much mercy as they possibly can, despite their enemy being so violent. Which, I don't know, I just thought that was kind of a nice little touch. And it came to pass that when they had sent them away, they pursued their march toward the land of Nephihah. And it came to pass that when they had come to the city of Nephihah, they did pitch their tents in the plains of Nephihah, which is near the city of Nephihah. Now Moroni was desirous that the Lamanites should come out to battle against them upon the plains, but the Lamanites, knowing of their exceedingly great courage, and beholding the greatness of their numbers, therefore they durst not come out against them, therefore they did not come to battle in that day. And when the night came, Moroni went forth in the darkness of the night, and came upon the top of the wall to spy out in what part of the city the Lamanites did camp with their army. And it came to pass that they were on the east by the entrance, and they were all asleep. And now Moroni returned to his army, and caused that they should prepare in haste strong cords and ladders, to be let down from the top of the wall into the inner part of the wall. And it came to pass that Moroni caused that his men should march forth, and come upon the top of the wall, and let themselves down into that part of the city, yea, even on the west, where the Lamanites did not camp with their armies. And it came to pass that they were all let down into the city by night, by the means of their strong cords and their ladders. Thus when the morning came, they were all within the walls of the city. And now when the Lamanites awoke and saw that the armies of Moroni were within the walls, they were affrighted exceedingly, insomuch that they did flee out by the pass. Now when Moroni saw that they were fleeing before him, he did cause that his men should march forth against them, and slew many, and surrounded many others, and took them prisoners, and the remainder of them fled into the land of Moroni, which was in the borders by the seashore. So I love a good stratagem, right, to get a city back. That is kind of what the war chapters is made of, right? How the Nephites get the cities back from the Lamanites, and how the Lamanites try and trick the Nephites. That is where all the learning and teaching in the war chapters come from, and I freaking love that. It's awesome. And in this case, I think that this specific experience of the Nephites taking back Nephihah from the Lamanites is a lesson in blind spots. Moroni was able to find out very easily that the Lamanites hid their entire army on the east side of the city. Not only that, but they were all asleep. So if you were to apply this principle to us, you could say that whoever this is has a blind spot, and they're only defending one part of themselves because that's what they're focusing on. When the real danger isn't what they're focusing on, but something else entirely. Because they don't broaden their focus, and they don't stay vigilant, that let the enemy, in this case the Nephites, let themselves down into a different part of the city. And so I feel like the Lamanites made two mistakes here, or maybe three. One, they put their armies only on one part of the city. Two, they were asleep. They seemingly had no guards or night watch or anything. And a third mini problem is that they allowed Moroni to get on the wall in the first place, because that is how Moroni got the information about their army placement in the city. And so allowing Moroni up on the wall basically negated the wall, right? Like, what point is the wall if you can just climb over it? Especially if you don't have night guards or you don't have night watch. And so again, this is a lesson in blind spots. They both had a blind spot in that they were only in one part of the city, and they had a blind spot at night, right? Because they were all asleep, because they assumed that the wall was enough. Because previously, in order to beat them, the Nephites had to get them out of the city. But in this case, the wall was not even an obstacle. But what it seems like is that the Lamanites assumed that the wall would completely keep out all Nephites, and so they didn't set up an army. And so their blind spot was assuming that their walls were perfect. And, that's a fair assumption, I think. Like I said, every other time that the Nephites got a city back, they managed to get the army out of the walls. But in this case, again, they got in. So yeah, I think this speaks to multiple blind spots, right? They weren't paying attention at night, they weren't paying attention because of their walls, and they weren't paying attention to the other part of the city that they weren't in. They were only focusing on one little section, right? And so, do you have blind spots? What do you focus on when it comes to defending from the temptations of Satan, defending from sin, whatever? What are you not focusing on? Because what you focus on tells you about what you don't focus on. And so, take a moment to self-reflect. You don't have to do big, extravagant things to, defend yourself against every possible thing ever, but just have a night guard, right? Just be a little bit more diligent. Just be a little bit more self-aware. Thus had Moroni and Pahoran obtained the possession of the city of Nephihah without the loss of one soul, and there were many of the Lamanites who were slain. Now it came to pass that many of the Lamanites that were prisoners were desirous to join the people of Ammon and become a free people. And it came to pass that as many as were desirous, unto them it was granted according to their desires. Therefore all the prisoners of the Lamanites did join the people of Ammon, and did begin to labor exceedingly, tilling the ground, raising all manner of grain, and flocks, and herds of every kind. And thus were the Nephites relieved from a great burden, yea, insomuch that they were relieved from all the prisoners of the Lamanites. And it came to pass that Moroni, after he had obtained possession of the city of Nephihah, having taken many prisoners, which did reduce the armies of the Lamanites exceedingly, and having regained many of the Nephites who had been taken prisoners, which did strengthen the army of Moroni exceedingly, therefore Moroni went forth from the land of Nephihah to the land of Nephi. And it came to pass that when the Lamanites saw that Moroni was coming against them, they were again frightened and fled before the army of Moroni. And it came to pass that Moroni and his army did pursue them from city to city, until they were met by Lehi and Teancum, and the Lamanites fled from Lehi and Teancum, even down upon the borders by the seashore, until they came to the land of Moroni. And the armies of the Lamanites were gathered together, insomuch that they were all in one body in the land of Moroni. Now Ammoron, the king of the Lamanites, was also with them. And it came to pass that Moroni and Lehi and Teancum did encamp with their armies round about in the borders of the land of Moroni, insomuch that the Lamanites were encircled about in the borders by the wilderness on the south, and in the borders by the wilderness on the east. And thus they did encamp for the night. For behold, the Nephites and the Lamanites were also weary because of the greatness of the march. Therefore they did not resolve upon any stratagem in the night time, save it were Teancum, for he was exceedingly angry with Ammoron, insomuch that he considered that Ammoron and Amalekite his brother had been the cause of this great and lasting war between them and the Lamanites, which had been the cause of so much war and bloodshed, yea, and so much famine. And it came to pass that Teancum, in his anger, did go forth into the camp of the Lamanites, and did let himself down over the walls of the city. And he went forth with a cord from place to place, insomuch that he did find the king, and he did cast a javelin at him, which did pierce him near the heart. But behold, the king did awaken his servants before he died, insomuch that they did pursue Teancum, and slew him. Now it came to pass that when Lehi and Moroni knew that Teancum was dead, they were exceedingly sorrowful, for behold, he had been a man who had fought valiantly for his country, yea, a true friend to liberty, and he had suffered very many exceedingly sore afflictions. But behold, he was dead, and had gone the way of all the earth. So Teancum does what Teancum does, right? This is kind of his thing. It's kind of his thing to go and murder Lamanite kings in their sleep. And Ammoron was killed, because it says that he did die, but the difference between when he killed Amalickiah and this time when he killed Ammoron is very subtle but very important, because this time he was killed, right? So clearly this time he did something wrong, or something less good than what he did last time. So if you read the verses where he killed Amalickiah, it says that he put a javelin into his heart, and this time it says he did cast a javelin at him, which did pierce him near the heart. And so before, he just stabbed him with a spear. But this time, he threw a javelin and it landed near his heart. And so the first time, he was a lot more decisive. He didn't throw it, he stabbed it with his own hand, and therefore he was a lot more accurate and a lot more direct. But having cast a javelin, he didn't have the perfect aim, it was kind of farther away, and so he didn't immediately kill Ammoron, and therefore he died. Ammoron woke up his guards and killed Teancum. And yes, Ammoron did die. But the fact that this time Teancum was less direct about taking him out led to his death. If you remember what Jesus says about sin, he says, hey, if your right arm offends you, cut it off, right? Jesus wants us to be very direct when it comes to dealing with our sins and dealing with what causes us to sin. And Ammoron is definitely a source of sin, right? He is a source of temptation and Satan and bad, right? He is not a great dude. And Teancum was decisive, but he wasn't as decisive as he was before, and that is why he died. And so when it comes to dealing with things that cause us to sin, or things that even tempt us to sin, be direct. Be severe, be strict, because stuff like that really, really matters. And the more direct you are, the easier it is to deal with. And obviously it's not going to be a walk in the park getting through sins that you struggle with, but being direct, being quick, being decisive really, really makes it easier. So that is the lesson that I'm pulling from this. And also, Teancum is awesome. And if he were to die in any way, this is, I think, how he wants to be remembered. He wants to be remembered murdering a Lamanite king in his sleep. Now it came to pass that Moroni marched forth on the morrow and came upon the Lamanites, insomuch that they did slay them with a great slaughter, and they did drive them out of the land, and they did flee, even that they did not return at this time against the Nephites. And thus ended the 31st year of the reign of the judges over the people of Nephi. And thus they had had wars and bloodsheds and famine and affliction for the space of many years. And there had been murders and contentions and dissensions and all manner of iniquity among the people of Nephi. Nevertheless, for the righteous' sake, yea, because of the prayers of the righteous, they were spared. But behold, because of the exceedingly great length of the war between the Nephites and the Lamanites, many had become hardened because of the exceedingly great length of the war, and many were softened because of their afflictions, insomuch that they did humble themselves before God, even in the depth of humility. And it came to pass that after Moroni had fortified those parts of the land which were most exposed to the Lamanites until they were sufficiently strong, he returned to the city of Zarahemla, and also Helaman returned to the place of his inheritance, and there was once more peace established among the people of Nephi. So, after the city of Nephihah is taken back, after Ammoron is killed, and the Nephites kind of deal with Ammoron's army after he's dead, there's peace. And something interesting that I really wanted to point out is in verse 41. It talks about how this war has dragged on. Like, it has been hard on all of the Nephites, right? Because being at war for multiple years sucks for anybody. Like, it's a really just sucky place to be for years on end. And what I think is really significant here is when it talks about how it affected people. Because it says in the beginning of verse 41, many had become hardened. And then literally the same sentence, and many were softened because of their afflictions, insomuch that they did humble themselves before God. And so some were hardened because of the difficulty and the affliction, and some were softened to bring themselves into humility before God. You choose how you respond to difficulty. You choose how it affects you. Does it bring you closer to God, or does it pull you away from Him? If you choose to lean in to the gospel and to belief and to faith, that, I think, is where you will find the most peace. I feel like in verse 41, those that humbled themselves before God, yea, it says, even in the depth of humility, those people probably found peace. They probably lived happier lives because they weren't constantly thinking about how awful the war was, but instead they were focusing more on their faith and growing that through humility and finding God in it all. But the people who were hardened by the war instead just became cynical. And so, again, you choose how you respond to afflictions. You can't choose the affliction, but you can choose your response to it, which is a very powerful thing. You can choose if you consecrate an affliction you go through unto God, or if you just let it make your life suck more. Either way, the affliction is going to be difficult. That is not going to change. But what you get from it can change. If you consecrate it to God, if you look for what to learn from it, if you humble yourself before Him, and if you build your faith through the affliction, then that is what you're going to get out of it. You're going to learn new lessons. You're going to grow as a person. You're going to become closer to Him, and your faith is going to be stronger. But if you just get beaten up by life and just let that make you angrier and make you sadder, then I don't think that helps anyone. And Moroni yielded up the command of his armies into the hands of his son, whose name was Moronihah, and he retired to his own house, that he might spend the remainder of his days in peace. And Pahoran did return to his judgment seat, and Helaman did take upon him again to preach unto the people the word of God. For because of so many wars and contentions, it had become expedient that a regulation should be made again in the church. Therefore Helaman and his brethren went forth, and did declare the word of God with much power, unto the convincing of many people of their wickedness, which did cause them to repent of their sins, and to be baptized unto the Lord their God. And it came to pass that they did establish again the church of God throughout all the land. Yea, and regulations were made concerning the law, and their judges and their chief judges were chosen. And the people of Nephi began to prosper again in the land, and began to multiply and wax exceedingly strong again in the land, and they began to grow exceedingly rich. But notwithstanding their riches, or their strength, or their prosperity, they were not lifted up in the pride of their eyes, neither were they slow to remember the Lord their God, but they did humble themselves exceedingly before him. Yea, they did remember how great things the Lord had done for them, that he had delivered them from death, and from bonds, and from prisons, and from all manner of afflictions, and he had delivered them out of the hands of their enemies. And they did pray unto the Lord their God continually, insomuch that the Lord did bless them according to his word, so that they did wax strong and prosper in the land. And it came to pass that all these things were done, and Helaman died in the 35th year of the reign of the judges over the people of Nephi. So this is a lovely chapter because, yes, it has war and it has battle and it has stratagem, and I love that part of the war chapters because it teaches us how to defend ourselves, yada yada. But it also talks about the aftermath. It talks about what happened then. They rebuilt the church. There was peace again. There was prosperity. People repented and got baptized, and things are good again. The war is finally, seemingly, over. The king of the Lamanites is dead. I'm sure there's another one, but I'm sure also he sucks a lot less than Ammoron did. And they finally have their cities back, and they can finally just live their lives. They no longer have to kill the Lamanites. And there are still war chapters ahead, but this section of the war is done. And finally, there is peace. Earlier in the chapter, it said that it was the 31st year of the reign of the judges, but at the end of the chapter, it says that Helaman died in the 35th year. So there has been multiple years of peace, which is miraculous. It must have felt so good for these Nephite people to finally just rest, to no longer have to fight their own brethren. So that's why I love this chapter, because it kind of feels like they can just breathe, right? They can let down their guard a little bit, not completely, of course, obviously, but they can kind of breathe, right? There's a little bit of respite to be had, and that's just a good feeling, because the war chapter is just battle after battle after battle after battle, and yes, each battle is fascinating, and they each teach us a different perspective and a different principle, but also, peace is better. Peace is preferable in every circumstance to war. So, yeah, it's a nice ending to the chapter. It feels very, very relaxing. So, the standout verse is going to be verse 49, which says, "But notwithstanding their riches, or their strength, or their prosperity, they were not lifted up in the pride of their eyes, neither were they slow to remember the Lord their God, but they did humble themselves exceedingly before him." So I like this verse because it basically acknowledges the pride cycle. If you know about the pride cycle in the Book of Mormon, basically, when the Nephites are prospering, they're righteous, they're happy, there's peace, they get really rich and they do really well, and therefore they get prideful, they get a little bit more sinful, and then, the Lamanites attack, they kind of get a little bit humbled by God, they're reminded, hey, we have mortality, right? We have to trust God for our defense, and so because of that struggle, because of that loss, they turn back to God, they humble themselves, and then once they're humble, they're righteous again. Then once they're righteous again, they get prosperous again. And then once they're prosperous again, they eventually get prideful again, and yada, yada, yada. The circle continues. And the verse before this one was the verse that said, hey, they began to prosper in the land. And if you remember, usually that is immediately followed by them getting prideful and being slow to remember God. But in this verse, it's basically a verse that says, no. You may think that's going to happen because that's how the pride cycle works, but no, they are not yet prideful. That's why it says, notwithstanding their riches or their strength or their prosperity, they were not lifted up in the pride of their eyes, neither were they slow to remember the Lord their God. So this verse is like, before you think they're going to get prideful, they weren't. They weren't even slow to remember the Lord their God, they were still righteous. Which leads me to better understand the fact that faith is always a choice. No matter what circumstances you are in, you can make the choice to love God. You can make the choice to be humble and faithful in Him. You don't have to be poor to make that choice. You don't have to be rich to make that choice. It is always a choice that you can make. Because sometimes in the Book of Mormon, you might think, oh, they're rich, therefore they're going to be prideful. That's just kind of how it goes, blah, blah, blah. Because, you can't be prosperous and faithful at the same time. But this verse is basically saying, no, faith is not up to your external circumstances. Faith is a personal choice that you make, regardless of circumstances. Regardless of how your life is, you choose to love God anyways. And that is why I like this verse. So yeah, that is the episode for today. I hope you enjoyed. It was definitely a long chapter, but it was very, very calming by the end. It wasn't perfectly peaceful the entire chapter, but the ending was really nice, so that was good. But yeah, there's just a few links down in the show notes that I want to mention to you. The first one is a let me know when you learn link, so if you're gonna shoot me a message and chat about something Book of Mormon related, you can do that there, or you can DM me on Instagram, which is probably more likely to actually get me, who knows. Next, there's some links to access a digital copy of the Book of Mormon, so if you don't have your own copy, but you do want to read along, you can go ahead and click those down below. You can also find study plans there, and chapters and books, and yada yada. Good stuff. Next, there's a quick support the show links. If you like what I do and you want to support me a little bit, anything you send will be greatly appreciated. Next, we're on YouTube, so if you're not already watching on YouTube, you can go ahead and find the podcast there twice a week, just on any other platform. And that's also where I post my YouTube shorts, which is really fun stuff. So yeah, go ahead and subscribe there. And finally, we are on Instagram, so if you want to find me where I'm the most active, where I post stories and interesting Book of Mormon reels and trivia, you can go ahead and follow me. I'll see you there. But yeah, that's all I got for you today. I'll talk to you later. Bye.